Hey guys, it's Chris at Highline Guitars. You're watching another one of my YouTube guitar building videos. If you're new to the channel, welcome. I hope that by the end of this video, I'll have earned your subscription. And of course, to everyone who's watching, if you enjoy this video or get something out of it, I would really love it if you would click that thumbs up button. And of course, if you would like to help support the channel financially so I can keep making these videos, you can visit eguitarplans.com. There's a link in the description below. Or you can visit my Highline Guitars merch store, which is displayed below the description for this video. Either way, whatever you purchase is going to help support the channel financially and you'll get something in return. But if you'd like to really keep it simple, you can click that thanks button and leave a tip in the amount that you want. So what I'm going to be talking about in today's video is part 8 of my electric violin build. And what that means is I'm going to be sanding the wood for the body, the neck, and the fingerboard and get it ready for the application of finish. So let's head out into the shop and start making some sanding dust. The first thing I had to do was remove all the tabs that were left over from the CNC process. And the technique that I like to use is to simply file them off using my Japanese Iwasaka files. They do a great job of removing those tabs, and I have a lot more control with those files than if I were to try to remove those tabs using like a sharp chisel. There's always the potential for gouging the wood with a sharp chisel if you're not careful. But with these Japanese Iwasaka files, I have way better control and I can blend the surface into the surrounding area. Next, I opted to use my belt sander as well as my oscillating spindle sander to remove as much of the glue squeeze out and tool marks as I could as quickly as possible. And both machines were set up with 80 grit sandpaper in order to make really quick work of removing those tool marks, the glue squeeze out, and to get all the shapes fine-tuned. With the power sanding finished, I was ready to move on to hand sanding. And to do that, I'm going to use my downdraft table. And of course, in a shop like mine, which I'm limited in terms of space, I use these flip-top tool stands in order to consolidate all the different tools that I have and to give myself as much room as possible. These things are really handy, and if you'd like to make your own, you can head over to eguitarplans.com or my Highline Guitars merch store and purchase plans to build your own. When I hand sand, I like to use nothing but P grade sandpapers, and you can tell they're P grade because in front of the grit designation there's the letter P. And the reason I like to use those sandpapers is because P grade sandpapers leave the most consistent scratch pattern. And when you move from say 150 grit to 220 to 320, 400 and so on, as you move up through the grits, the surface quality is so much better than if you were to use a non-P grade sandpaper. There's also K grade, which is a Japanese sandpaper designation system, and it works even better. However, it's much more difficult to find it. My hand sanding strategy is basically the same as it always is with all of my guitar building projects. I started out with a P150 grit sandpaper, and I'm going to sand the entire body, neck, and fingerboard and make sure that I try to remove all of the tool marks, any surface flaws that I might find, and try to get the surface looking as perfect as I can possibly get it. At that point, I can then move on to a P220, followed by a P320, and then I'll probably finish up with a P400. But then I might go to a Super Acelix K600 to really get a smooth surface before I apply the finish. Sanding with the P150 grit sandpaper means that it can be difficult to see the quality of the surface. It just doesn't reveal itself very well. So what I like to do is use a bright 100-watt LED bulb in a shop light fixture so that I can view the surface of the wood with the light at a low angle. And that helps me to see flaws that otherwise would escape detection in normal shop lighting. I always try to sand in the direction of the grain. However, since I'm going to be sanding to 400 grit, it really isn't necessary to do that. Now, if you're wondering, how do I get the sanding dust out of the inside of the body of the violin? I just suck it out with my dust collector. Before I could sand the neck and fingerboard, I had to glue the fingerboard to the neck. So I applied some Type Bond Original wood glue and then sprinkled a few grains of table salt onto the surface of the wood glue in order to prevent the fingerboard from sliding around as I applied clamping pressure. And speaking of clamping pressure, instead of using the usual C-clamps, I used a length of rubber bicycle inner tube, which I wrapped around the neck and the fingerboard in order to apply sufficient clamping pressure. After I finished wrapping up the neck and fingerboard with the inner tube, I let the glue dry for 3 to 4 hours. Then I came back and removed the inner tube. Before I could start sanding the neck, I had to drill the holes for the tuning machines, and to do that I printed out a full-size copy of my headstock with those tuner locations clearly marked. Then I used a center punch to mark the position of where I would need to drill those holes. Of course, to drill the holes into the headstock, I used my drill press and a 3/8 inch diameter brad point drill bit. And I set the depth of the bit so that the tip of the brad point would just come through the back side of the headstock. That way it wouldn't tear out any of the wood. Then what I could do after drilling the 4 holes in the front side of the headstock is I could flip it over and finish drilling the holes from the other side. That way I get a nice clean hole on both sides. Sanding the neck follows basically the same process as sanding the body. I started with 150 grit, and what I like to do is wrap the sandpaper around different size objects made of different materials. For example, here I'm using, it's a large rubber eraser that I purchased at my local dollar store. And I like to use these because they conform to the contour shape of the surface. But I also like to use the rubber sleeves from my oscillating spindle sander. I've used wooden dowels and lengths of different diameter PVC pipe. Whatever you can find that is going to serve as a good support for the sandpaper. And then, like I did with the body, I'll use a bright shop light, a 100-watt LED bulb, to look at the surface to see if I've removed all the tool marks and whatever flaws might be in the surface. And then once I've finished with the 150 grit, I'll move up through the different grits. I'll switch to 220 grit, then 320, 400, and I'll probably go as high as 600 grit. The time and effort that's required for sanding out the tool marks can be reduced based on the CNC strategy, specifically the finishing strategy. I could adopt a finishing strategy which would result in a surface that would be so smooth I could actually start sanding at probably 220, 320, maybe even 400 grit. However, that strategy would take a significant amount of time on the CNC machine to achieve a surface that smooth. And since I'm still going to have to deal with glue squeeze out as well as those tabs that hold the part into the blank, I'm still going to have to sand at a fairly coarse sanding grit like 150 grit. So I keep my finishing strategy simple and therefore faster, so that I can keep moving with the project instead of waiting for it to get finished on the CNC machine. While I was sanding the body, I noticed a little bit of tear out around one of the F-holes that needed to be repaired. So what I did was I took a piece of masking tape and I formed a dam around that damaged area. Then what I did was I created some mahogany sanding dust, which I then sprinkled and brushed in over the top of that damaged area. Next, I used some thick gap-filling CA glue, which I applied directly to the sanding dust. And I didn't use any accelerator here because I wanted to have maximum working time so that I could use a toothpick to mix up that sanding dust with the glue and then pack it into where that damage had occurred. Once the glue had dried, I removed the tape and then sanded down the repair until it blended with the rest of the body. After sanding to P400 grit, I decided that was far enough. I didn't have to go any further. So what I did next was I wiped down the surface with some mineral spirits, which darkens the wood. And then when you look at it with a 100-watt LED bulb at a low angle, you can really see the flaws that may still be present in the wood that would have escaped detection while sanding it. And as you can see here on the neck, there is some tool marks that still need to be sanded out. So using the mineral spirits in conjunction with the bright shop light really helps you to see those flaws, which would otherwise be invisible and would jump out the minute I started to apply my finish. And then the last bit of work I had to do before applying the finish was to remove some of the tool marks inside the F-holes. And to do that, I just used a really small diamond jeweler's file to file out those tool marks. All right, guys, well, that's all the time I have for this episode. In the next episode, which will be part 9, I plan to start applying the finish to the body, the neck, and the fingerboard. And that's going to be a hand-rubbed, polymerized tung oil finish. So be sure to check that out. And if you don't subscribe to the channel, be sure to click that subscribe button. That way you won't miss any of these videos as they get posted. And until that next episode, take care, stay safe, and I hope you'll be back for part 9.